feel we ought to have the school bell, you know. Could it be a bit up, please? I'm sorry, I couldn't see on the first day. I hope it didn't appear too obvious, but I don't like to be able not to see what I've got on my papers in front of me. Well, today you know that the lecture is going to be, we're going to do another leap in history from the 1870s and the financial scandals that we were talking about yesterday in Trollope to the First World War. And of all the many, many First World War books, I have very selfishly chosen Robert Graves, because as you know, I'm working on Robert Graves. And having loved Sassoon and having loved his book on the First World War, it's been quite a challenge to switch registers, as it were. Robert Graves quite, I hope you'll agree, quite clearly gives life to that period of 4 years in England and Europe, as far as this book is concerned, although as far as you're concerned, you had your own areas affected by the First World War. But Graves manages to give life to his little sector of the war. It wasn't quite so little. I mean, for a man who was intimately involved in the Battle of Loos in 1915, September 1915, and the Battle of the Somme in July 1916, I think we might call that quite an intimate engagement, two of the greatest battles of the First World War. Sassoon then went on to the Battle of Arras, I think probably trying to get one up on Robert Graves. But as an introduction to this, I want to read to you, because I've been reading with my students in London the work of Ivor Gurney, and I thought, as a little-known First World War poet, but poetry from a man who was himself a private in the First World War, as well as a musician, and who ended his life very sadly in a mental hospital, and died many years after the war, a disappointed, sad, and failed man. I would like to read you a poem that he wrote just after the war, or during the war, The Silent One. And there's just one line, perhaps, that I should explain in advance. Bucks, Buckinghamshire. A lovely Bucks accent is a Buckinghamshire accent. A warm, homely sort of accent, clearly, in the eyes of the man writing the poem, his friend, Ivor Gurney. The Silent One. Who died on the wires and hung there, one of two? Who for his hours of life had chattered through infinite lovely chatter of Buck's accent, yet faced unbroken wires, stepped over and went, a noble fool, faithful to his stripes, and ended. But I, weak, hungry, and willing only for the chance of line, to fight in the line, lay down under unbroken wires, and saw the flashes and kept unshaken, till the politest voice, a finicking accent said, "Do you think you might crawl through there? There's a hole." In the afraid darkness shot at, I smiled as politely replied, "Afraid not, sir." There was no hole, no way to be seen, nothing but chance of death after tearing of clothes. Kept flat and watched the darkness, hearing bullets whizzing, and thought of music, and swore deep hearts, deep oaths, polite to God, and retreated, and came on again, retreated, and a second time faced the screen. Just one little section of the First World War brought to life through literature, of course. Goodbye to All That was by no means the first book to describe experiences in the First World War. As early as 1916, Henri Barbusse had written a book which Sassoon himself and Graves found extraordinary in its description, called Le Feu, Under Fire, it's translated in English. And that same year, 1916, Graves himself had started a novel on the subject. Interestingly, he didn't continue with it as a novel, and we'll talk a little bit about why he decided to make it an autobiography instead. Shortly afterwards, in 1917, one of Robert Graves's fellow soldiers in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the regiment, battalion to which Sassoon and Graves had both belonged. And this book was by Bernard Adams and was called Nothing of Importance. So very early on in the war, there were accounts of it, although not nearly as many, you'll see, as there were later on. Ford Madox Ford published the first of his 4 books of Parade's End. You may have seen that on television. One can always rely on television. In 1924. Herbert Reed published a highly critical account of the war. I think as time went on, they felt they could be more critical, perhaps more honest about it. In Retreat in 1925. And in 1928 came the first of the flood. All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque, which of course is one of the most famous books of the war. Siegfried Sassoon's Memoirs of a Fox-Hunting Man, and Edmund Blunden's Undertones of War. It was the start of that flood of war books, which initially Robert Graves had no intention of joining in with. For in 1928, he was still basking in the financial and critical success of a book which made him very popular indeed, a book on T.E. Lawrence called Lawrence and the Arabs. He'd become friends with Lawrence at Oxford in 1920, and Lawrence had said, Graves should write my book. Wonderful commission for a young man. The acclaim also for his collaboration with a young American woman, Laura Riding, a book called A Survey of Modernist Poetry in 1927, which became a very established text in the examination of poetry at that period. But in his agreement in 1928 to write an introduction to yet another First World War memoir, American this time, and I wonder how many of you have read it. I had one student once who'd read it, and now I can boast that I've read it, The Enormous Room. Anybody read The Enormous Room? And you're all the best read people I know in Cape Town, so I don't stand much chance of finding a reader elsewhere, do I? We know E.E. Cummings, of course, more as a poet, but his book on the First World War, his time in a prisoner of war camp, well, an incarceration really of some kind, I don't quite know whether it was a prisoner of war or what, is an extraordinary read and highly critical. And Graves had been recommended by his publisher, Cape, again, I think through Lawrence, to write the introduction to this book. The book had originally come out in 1922. When it came out in England, Graves sat down to write an introduction, and it's that, I believe, which made him think, why shouldn't I write my own book about my experiences in the First World War? There are at least two incidents in that introduction which appear in his book, Goodbye to All That. The style and approach in Goodbye to All That is much nearer to another book that appeared the year Graves's book appeared, 1929, a man who is really Richard Aldington, who is really very bitter and cynical about the war. The style and approach then would certainly be nearer to Cummings and to other very critical people, to Cummings's directness and lack of reverence for authority. I think that's what marks the book partly. Much nearer to that than to Sassoon's and Blunden's heavily nostalgic, poetical, gently humorous and deliberately unsensational books, which is, of course, why some of us love Memoirs of a Fox-Hunting Man and Undertones of War. Nevertheless, you can love two very different things. It's clear from Graves's opening paragraph onwards that goodbye will be both forthright and unsentimental. Possibly rather shocking, because that first paragraph is a little shocking in its confession. The objects, this is extract 2, the objects of this autobiography, written at the age of 33, are simple enough. An opportunity for a formal goodbye to you, and to you, and to you, and to me, and to all that. So that's the first object. The second one, forgetfulness. Because once all this has been settled in my mind and written down and published, it need never be thought about again. And he suffered greatly from terrible nightmares and shell shock through the 20s. So obviously forgetfulness was a highly desirable end. And the third one, money. And I won't digress here too much, but there is a wonderful story about why he needed the money, which some of you have heard already, about Laura Riding, the young American woman, jealous about another man she'd fallen in love with, jumping out of a fourth floor window and needing a great deal of hospital treatment when she miraculously walked again. So Graves had to write some money, and cynically he thought, I'll do it, I'll write my book. And so he did. The book doesn't open with the First World War, as some of you will know. At its most obvious level, all that probably means the confusion and unhappinesses of his past. So it isn't just the First World War, although that is very much the object of the second half of the book. It also includes his childhood, which appears to me from a distance to be a very happy one, incidentally, but also his school days. He changed schools about 7 times in all, not always a very happy experience. So the first 5 chapters devoted to his growing up in Wimbledon, a suburb of London, with his 2 brothers, 2 younger brothers, 2 older sisters, Harlech in Wales, where they had a lovely family home in idyllic surroundings, and Germany, because, and this complicated his attitude towards the war, his own mother was German, an aristocratic German at that, Amalia von Ranke-Graves. You can imagine how they loved it in the army when he was announced as Robert von Ranke-Graves, with his friend Siegfried Sassoon. I think that's probably what made them friends initially. Incidentally, I don't feel that it's just that he's saying goodbye to, quite as resolutely as he intended. In fact, he seems to be remembering some of his childhood with not a little nostalgia, despite its inevitable miseries at time. And it's a wonderful historical document in another sense too, because, of course, what do we know about London at the turn of the century? He was born in 1895 into a world, as his sister reminds us, of gaslights, hansom cabs, and servants, and 20-bedroom houses for him, not for the servants, of course. And so it is also a picture of the Victorian, the last years of the Victorian age. It's a most enjoyable read in that respect as well. And the next 3 chapters devoted, as I said, to his unhappiness at school, but particularly at his public school, always a favourite target for young men writing one of their early books, isn't it? Charterhouse, where he encountered some of the greatest bullying of his life, but also where he made great friends as well. Why did I put Laura Riding? Oh yes, because Laura Riding was perhaps responsible for the fierce criticism of public schools. Being a very democratic American, she disapproved highly, not just of his rather bourgeois family, but also of his public private school education, and I think made her feelings very clear. So as he's writing it, you feel that he is influenced retrospectively, possibly, in his account of that. He admitted to his friend, the extraordinary writer whom I can never quite understand, Gertrude Stein, that his comments in Goodbye to All That were quite ruthless, but he insisted that they had been written without indignation. Well, tell that to his family, I say, because of course the family were absolutely devastated to see themselves portrayed as such unsympathetic and bourgeois people. Again, I think Laura's rather strange influence on Robert. Nevertheless, Robert Graves's father, Alfred Percival Graves, also a poet and writer, though not of the kind Laura approved of. He was an Irishman. He had written some wonderfully popular songs in Ireland. He'd made a great name for himself. He was part of the Irish Literary Society in England. He was a friend of Yeats. He knew everybody, and he was very helpful to Robert Graves in his establishing of himself as a poet. He said to him in a book that he wrote in return, which seemed to me rather witty, a book called, it was called To Return to All That. Because, of course, there's nothing worse than somebody publishing a book in which they criticize you and you have no means of reply. So the publisher, ever anxious to make another penny or two, said to the father, hey, why don't you add a few chapters on what you feel about your son's book? Always a very good idea, isn't it? Family rows attract an awful lot of attention. So the father wrote, and I think wrote very mildly because he was adored by both his father and his mother. He said, he gives me no credit for the interest I always felt and shared in his poetry. During the war, I offered poem after poem of his to editor after editor, and even arranged with Harold Munro of the Poetry Bookshop, who was a great figure of the period, to whom I introduced Robert for the publication of his first book of poems. This was in 1915, when he was, how old would he have been? 1915, yes, he was 20, wasn't he? Sorry, I should have worked that out instantly. Over the Brazier, his first book of poems, all of which is true, what the father says, but the truth, as Robert Graves himself believes, and as Goodbye to All That would make plain, was not factual so much as emotional for Robert Graves. How it felt to Robert himself, or rather how he remembered it, and this will be a great bone of contention when he publishes his own account of what the First World War was like. And although the next chapter's fairly harmless, marvelous chapter, describing his friendship with George Mallory. Does anybody know George Mallory, the great Everest climber, the great rock climber, was his English history teacher at school and took Robert Graves climbing on several occasions into Wales and other places. And he established a very firm relationship with Mallory, was devastated when Mallory died in 1924. So that's an interesting chapter. But it was the period of the First World War, which of course attracted most attention and which infuriated, is my microphone? Yes, which infuriated many of Sassoon's, many of Graves's friends, including Sassoon. Sassoon, who had been in the same regiment, at one point the same battalion, was particularly incensed because he knew the facts, which he insisted on, better than Graves himself. But of course it was the period to which he felt the strongest need to say goodbye, because it was a period in which he had suffered intensely. And he mentions this, sometimes in a very heartfelt way, sometimes rather lightheartedly, the death of so many young men who surrounded him, his position, he quickly became a captain, and his position in having to tell men to go to their deaths. All of that, I think, comes into the book. it is the period which dominates the book, 16 chapters devoted to it in a memoir of about twice that many, over half the book actually. He'd already used the phrase "all that" in his introduction to Cummings, so it's quite clear what he's doing. It was Graves's rather cavalier attitude towards the facts in this wartime section then, which irritated Sassoon. And Sassoon's friend and Robert Graves's friend, Edmund Blunden. Graves had already antagonized Blunden earlier by implying that he had alcoholic tendencies, which he had. In fact, it was Blunden's second wife, Claire Blunden, when I was interviewing her about Sassoon, who said to me, "You know, I think I didn't notice while we were in Singapore. It wasn't the best place for him. He did have an interest in the bottle." She said, "I only thought about that afterwards." So he did. I mean, there was no doubt about that. But Graves was not the most tactful. He was a bull in a china shop, as Blunden called him. And when the book came out in 1929, the end of 1929, it was not surprising that Blunden himself should write, in response, I have to say, to a rather fierce review by Robert Graves the year before of Blunden's book, all these infights that go on. He wrote a very damning review, Blunden, of the book. Sassoon's grievances against Graves were even stronger. Plus, he had a particular dislike of factually vague stories, though there may have been an element of jealousy against Graves and his success. He disliked Eric Remarque because he said it was all so vague. You didn't know where you were, you didn't know the place names, etc., etc. But it made an awful lot of money, of course. Perhaps because he and Graves had been such good friends during the war. He'd visited the Graves family in Harlech and had a wonderful trip there. And Graves had returned with Sassoon to Kent. But Sassoon's mother was suffering deeply in 1916. This was just towards the end, September 1916. She was still suffering greatly from the death of her youngest son, who was a casualty of Gallipoli. And she was trying desperately to contact him through spiritualism. And so late at night there would be rappings and tappings coming from her room. And Graves actually reports some of this, which Sassoon, understandably, finds unforgivable. He doesn't name Mrs. Sassoon, he doesn't name Sassoon himself, but Graves never forgave him for what he saw as his disloyalty. Sorry? Sassoon. I'm sorry, there was a great murmur and I wondered what I'd said. The other thing that annoyed him was that Graves had actually included a long verse poem, which I've included some of at extract 3 for you, without his permission. And so Sassoon had a great pleasure in visiting the publisher just as goodbye to all that was coming out and saying, "You can't publish it with my poem in it and that description of my mother, or I'll sue you." And of course, the publisher, with all those pound notes in his eyes, all that money waiting for him, because he knew it was going to be a great success, decided that he would put asterisks in instead. So if you have a 1929 copy of Goodbye to All That with asterisks in it, you're sitting on a fortune. Sassoon insisted that both the poem and the reference went, but still the book enjoyed enormous success. Meantime, Sassoon and Blunden decided that the book was so dreadfully inaccurate that they had to do a demolition job on it, and there's a wonderful copy of the book in the Berg Library in New York, in which, in both handwritings, very clearly, plus the regimental doctor, there are comments about, "This isn't true. They didn't go to this brothel. this is inaccurate, not that many people were killed. Things that really, as one's reading them, I don't think one would know one way or the other. But to Sassoon and Blunden, who had been there, who'd been in the war, it mattered immensely. Graves didn't really worry at all. You know that popular saying, he was laughing all the way to the bank? Because the book sold hugely. It sold, I think, let me see, 30,000 copies in the first month, and Sassoon's had sold 15,000, which was considered very good indeed. So I think it was Graves who was laughing and Sassoon who was annoyed. In commenting on this, Blunden said in his opening, on the opening paragraph about reasons for writing this book, they are all selfish. He does not seem to guess what is the best reason for autobiography: to add one's utmost to the fund of human record, which will make a friendlier and better understanding world. Well, of course, that's a very high-minded motive when you're writing a book for money, and it didn't worry Graves in the least. There is another copy that I'm terribly excited to have found, annotated by Sassoon alone, in which he crosses out the subtitle, an autobiography, underneath Goodbye to All That, and writes, Mummy's Little Bedtime Story. The implication being, of course, that this is all entirely made up. Graves himself, it's had a very interesting reaction to these criticisms because he was well aware of them. He refused to apologize for any, and it's an interesting point, a very interesting point, a very important point about any memoir and any recollections of the past. He refused to apologize for any factual inaccuracies in his book, arguing that there are two kinds of reality. And of course, this is really at the center of what we're talking about, two kinds of reality. Because you remember in War and Peace, Tolstoy saw that Battle of Borodino as a great triumph for the Russians, whereas in fact historians often see it as a defeat in terms of numbers. So the two kinds of realities. One is what actually happened, which belongs to the historian or the chronicler of regimental histories, who is trying to pin down the numbers and the actual events and the places. The other is what it was like, what happened to the person who was there, which belongs to the individual. While Sassoon and Blunden strove conscientiously for strict factual accuracy, and may even have lessened the immediacy of their account in doing so, I mean, one does get rather weary, well, I do, of so many people killed after a while. Graves had no time for it, nor would he have done so had he been able, he claimed. For as he explains in a fascinating book, which is a postscript, he calls it a postscript to Goodbye to All That. It's published in another book called But It Still Goes On, and it does still go on, doesn't it, war? In 1930, there are different kinds of war books, he says, and a factual accuracy was not his prime aim. I'll read you what he said. It was practically impossible, he says, as well as forbidden, to keep a diary in any active trench sector or to send letters home which would be of any great post-war documentary value. And of course, that is true, isn't it? And the more efficient the soldier, the less time, of course, he took from his job to write about it. Great latitude should therefore be allowed to a soldier who has since got his facts or dates mixed. Talk about special pleading. I would even paradoxically say that the memoirs of a man who went through some of the worst experiences of trench warfare are not truthful if they do not contain a high proportion of falsities. You know, the kind of person who can argue the hind leg off a donkey? High explosive barrages will make a temporary liar or visionary of anyone. the old trench mind is at work, dwelling on horrors, mixing of dates and confusion between trench rumours and scenes actually witnessed. Now, there's a very interesting comment on this by Paul Fussell, who is one of the leading authorities on the First World War, and his book, The Great War and Modern Memory, is well worth reading, very, very readable, but very authoritative. He goes so far as to argue that if Goodbye to All That really were a documentary transcription of the actual, it would be worth very little, and would surely not be, as it is, infinitely rereadable. That's the end of the quote. It's ironic that the main reason Sassoon and Blunden objected to Goodbye to All That, its factual inaccuracy, should be part of the reason why it appealed to so many readers. Written in great haste, it was written in 11 weeks in all, which if any of you have ever written a book, you will think is not possible. It's undeniably careless in a number of ways, as Graves's friend and first serious biographer, Martin Seymour Smith, argues. It was not meant to be a work of art. But it has something the other two more composed works don't have, he claims. Goodbye to All That sums up the fears and hopes of the generation who experienced the war with a pertinence that could hardly admit of a strictly literary treatment. The point of Blunden's and Sassoon's non-journalistic memoirs was that they had not rejected the past, even though they had lost it. Their accounts are poignant because they are set against, because they contrast with the decencies and the beauties and the quietness of the traditional past. Now, Graves, though a respecter of tradition, was not at that time concerned with it. Well, you can already see he loves to shock. He's a rebel, Seymour Smith says, and he was in revolt. This revolt was not against the kind of tradition which Blunden and Sassoon loved, and for which their nostalgia is so compelling. It was against the present. Sassoon and Blunden, reclusive men, were too removed from the real present to be able to bear it. What moved them was the loss of the old things, symbolized above all by war. It's an interesting point of view, isn't it? And I think represents the difference in character and lifestyle between the three men. Fussell argues convincingly that we need all three viewpoints, Graves as much as his more conscientious rivals, that together, not separately, they have, quote, effectively memorialized the Great War as an historical experience. They are all three, quote, the classic memoirists of the period. Just as well, none of them were alive to read Fussell when that was published. The more self-consciously literary works, of course, of Blunden and Sassoon being balanced by this very slapdash, journalistic, but very lively account from Graves in what Arnold Bennett wrote at the time was a fine, straightforward prose style, and what Blunden called slipshod and incoherent in his review. Though Goodbye, unlike memoirs of Fox Hunting Man, did not win any literary prizes, as I told you, it sold very well indeed, and its sales had reached 30,000 after the first month, as compared with half of that for Sassoon. And since he'd made it, as he candidly admitted, to make money, he'd written it, that was something that Graves wanted to achieve very much indeed. After marrying very young in 1918 to an 18-year-old girl, he was 23, she was 18, and having 4 children in quick succession, then meeting Laura Riding, that nasty American lady. I don't know that she is. I'm trying to love Laura Riding. I'm not finding it at all easy. But after that, he had a problem. He had to pay for his wife and children, he had to pay for Laura's treatment when she decided to jump out of the window in that high-handed way of hers. So he did need an awful lot of money. But in doing so, he also, I think, wanted to say goodbye to all that had given rise to it. England, English way of life, his English family. And so at the end of the book, when it's established, he and Laura set off for Mallorca, which of course is another stage of his story. So it is really literally a goodbye. He doesn't describe that period about jumping out of the window, unfortunately, but on the whole, candor rules, inspired largely by his refusal to accept received opinion. And what I like about the book, and I'm going to talk about the book more now, is that it is an honest look, a candid look at the army. Something, I think, which at times can be quite shocking. I like his stories particularly, but as you notice, the stories always seem to have a point. Take, for instance, his description of his training period with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers at Wrexham in Wales. And this is extract 5. I have one or two random memories of this training period at Wrexham. The landlord of my billet was a Welsh solicitor who greatly overcharged us while pretending amicability. He wore a wig, or to be more exact, he had 3 wigs with hair of progressive lengths. When he had worn the medium-sized hair for a few days, he would put on the wig with long hair and say that, dear him, it was time to get a haircut. Then he would go out of the house and in a public lavatory perhaps, or a wayside copse, would change into the short-haired wig, which he wore until it was time to change to the medium one again. This deception was only discovered when one of the officers billeted with me got drunk and raided his bedroom. This officer, whose name was Williams, what a surprise, a Welsh regiment from battalion with a name like Williams. When they weren't called Williams, they were called Jones. Jones 1, Jones 2, Jones 3, all the way through. This officer, whose name was Williams, was an extreme example of the sly border Welshman. The drunker he got, the more shocking his confessions. He told me one day about a girl he'd got engaged to in Dublin and even slept with on the strength of a diamond engagement ring. Only paste, really, he said. The day before the wedding, she had had a foot cut off by a Dalkey tram, and he had hurriedly left the city. But Graves, she was a lovely, lovely girl before that happened. He had been a medical student at Trinity College, Dublin. Whenever he went to Chester, the nearest town, to pick up a prostitute, he not only used to appeal to her patriotism to charge him nothing, but he always gave them my name. I knew of this because these women used to write to me. One day I said to him in the mess, in future, you are going to be distinguished from all the other Williamses in the regiment by being called Dirty Williams. The name stuck. By one shift or another, he escaped all trench service except for a short spell in a quiet sector and lasted the war out safely. Now you see how it turns from humour into something much more threatening. The idea of these soldiers who aren't there except to save their skins, who have to be there, but who are not going to go out and fight. So although there is a great deal of humour, it is often loaded humour. And the way in which it's told, of course, keeps one reading. I mean, what an entertaining read it is. And yet, underneath, what serious messages there are if you read carefully. Fairly shocking stuff, in fact, by 1929 standards. Another effect of the first-person narrator, apart from drawing one into the story and allowing for humorous anecdotes is to give an immediacy to the account and permit the author to include minute details of the scene as well as the emotions it arouses. The following passage occurs, this is extract 6, at the end of July 1915 near Loos. Loos, the main Battle of Loos took place in September 1915 and October, a little bit of October too, but there had been a very big build-up to it, and in July 1915, Graves was near Loos. I went out, he writes, from Red Lamp Corner with Sergeant Townsend at about 10 o'clock. We both had revolvers. We pulled socks with the toes cut off over our bare knees to prevent them showing up in the dark and to make crawling easier. We went 10 yards at a time, slowly, not on all fours, but wriggling flat along the ground. After each movement, we lay and watched for about 10 minutes. We crawled through our own wire entanglements and along a dry ditch, ripping our clothes on more barbed wire, glaring into the darkness till it began turning round and round. Once I snatched my fingers in horror from where I had planted them on the slimy body of an old corpse, nudging each other with rapidly beating hearts at the slightest noise or suspicion, crawling, watching, crawling, shamming dead under the blinding light of enemy flares, and again crawling, watching, crawling. A 2nd Battalion officer who had revisited these Levante trenches after the war was over told me of the ridiculously small area of no man's land compared with the size it seemed on the long, painful journeys that he had made over it. It was like the real size of the hollow in a tooth compared with the size it feels to the tongue. And so it goes on in the last 2 lines. We got back after making the journey of perhaps 200 yards in rather more than 2 hours. It's that kind of description, that kind of memory, I think, which brings alive what it was really like to be in the trenches. The style of the passage is more dramatic than usual. Normally, Graves writes in a fairly flat tone. I think one of the effects of this is to make his material much more shocking when it comes. Cultivating a deliberate flatness, a matter-of-factness, which is in itself startling when something really dramatic happens. And this is particularly evident when the author arrives at the most dramatic point in his story, that is, his own near-death experience at the Battle of the Somme in July 1916. Most of it, for once, factually correct, as you might imagine. I think he remembered that very clearly. It was a point at which he himself believed that he was on his last drawing his last breath. His battalion, the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, had been told on the 19th of July 1916 that they would be, this was in the aftermath of that great opening day of the Somme, in which 60,000 British troops had been, or Allied troops rather, had been either reported missing, wounded, or dead. So it was an appalling opening. But the battle dragged on, and on the 19th, his battalion, the 2nd, was told that they must wait in Bazantin churchyard to attack High Wood. But while they waited, in reserve, the Germans put down a barrage along the ridge where they were lying, and Graves was one of the casualties. I'll read you a bit of it. It's extract 7. And this is his own near death. He is explaining. It was heavy stuff, 6 and 8 inch. There was so much of it that we decided to move back 50 yards. It was when I was running that an 8-inch shell burst about 3 paces behind me. I was able to work that out afterwards by the line of my wounds. I heard the explosion and felt as though I'd been punched rather hard between the shoulder blades, but had no sensation of pain. I thought that the punch was merely the shock of the explosion, when blood started trickling into my eyes, and I felt faint and called to Moody, "I've been hit." Then I fell down, and so on, and a paragraph down. One piece of shell went through my left thigh, high up near the groin. I must have been at the full stretch of my stride to have escaped emasculation. I might add here, he went on to have 8 children. The wound over my eye was nothing. It was a little chip of marble, possibly from one of the Byzantine cemetery headstones. This and a finger wound, which split the bone, probably came from another shell that burst in front of me. The main wound was made by a piece of shell that went in 2 inches below the point of my right shoulder and came out through my chest 2 inches above my right nipple in a line. And so it goes on, and it's very factual, isn't it? This is where it went in, this is where, and very little about how he feels at this point. And then he says, "My memory of what happened next is vague. Apparently, Dr. Dunn came up through the barrage with a stretcher bearer, dressed my wounds and got me down to the old German dressing station at the north end of Mametz Wood. I just remember being put on the stretcher and winking at the stretcher bearer sergeant, who was looking at me and saying, 'Old Gravy's got it all right.' The dressing station was overworked that day. I was laid in a corner on a stretcher and remained unconscious for more than 24 hours. And so, of course, what happens is that the colonel writes to the family to tell them that he's dead. He's been told that he's dead. So the family receives the news of his death. They read it in the Times, and then an aunt who happens to be in France says, "But I've just seen him alive in hospital." Now, why would you need to write a novel when you have material like that? It's a ready-made drama, isn't it? And really, effectively, the end of his active war experience, although he goes on until about January 1919, serving in the British Army, training cadets and doing things like that. But it's a very dramatic story, and it's one which I think he dined out on quite a lot afterwards. If Graves does hit a dull spot, he can always liven it up with one of his many anecdotes, most of them highly amusing, even absurd, but some occasionally reminding us, and the occasional is important. He doesn't want you to feel that this is to get at you. He's not trying to convert you. But at the same time, he seems to be himself aware that there is this other side to the war that must be faced up to. He's talking here about underage as well as overage recruits in his battalion by mid-1915. For instance, as he tells us in Extract 8, there were 5 of these boys. William Bumford, Collier, for instance, who gave his age as 18, was really only 15. He used to get into trouble for falling asleep on sentry duty. The official penalty for this was death, but I had observed that he could not help it. I had seen him suddenly go to sleep on his feet while holding a sandbag open for another fellow to fill. So we got him a job as an orderly to a chaplain for a while. Always a safe job, they said in the army. And a few months later, all men over 50 and all boys under 18 were combed out and sent to the base. Bumford and Burford was overage, were both sent, but neither escaped the war. Bumford was old enough to be sent back to the battalion in the later stages of the war and was killed. Burford was killed too in a bombing accident on the base camp, or so I was told. The fate of many of my comrades in France have come to me merely as hearsay. So it is clear from this and many other passages in Goodbye to All That, that he's he's not trying to emphasize the heroic nature of war. He omits themes which I think are much more prevalent in Sassoon of honor and nobility, although of course Sassoon thinks the war is a dreadful thing, but the nobility of the men often strikes him. So Graves has no need of the elevated style of a Rupert Brooke, does he? His own voice is ideal for the subjects he chooses to discuss. Under the general topic of life in France, he chooses to focus on life in the trenches, including such unpleasant and wholly realistic first-hand stories of the officer who, waking in the night and hearing scuffling, quote, shone his torch on his bed and found 2 rats on his blanket tussling for the possession of a severed hand. This, Graves tells us, and perhaps this is as revealing as the severed hand, this, Graves tells us, circulated round the battalion, quote, as a great joke. I suppose what he's really indicating is the need to defend oneself against such horrors with humour. Gas was another nightmare for the soldiers, which he goes into, especially in the early part of the war, when gas masks were still very primitive affairs. You've probably seen them. They come down like a sort of little curtain, and were still issued also with conflicting instructions for use, which didn't help. In any case, they were totally ineffective in the case of Robert Graves, who had a nose broken from rugby and who therefore couldn't breathe through his nose and therefore couldn't use the gas mask. So, I mean, you can imagine how he felt about gas. Sounds too gain a life of their own under Graves's first-hand account of their effect on him. It's not just that he's describing the sounds, he's telling you how he feels about it. And I think this is one of the ways in which history is brought alive, isn't it, in an account like this. Extract 9, sausages are easy to see and dodge, presumably some kind of shell, but they make a terrible noise when they drop. We have had about 10 casualties in our company today from them. I find that I have an extraordinarily quick reaction to danger, but everyone gets like that. We can sort out all the different explosions and disregard all the ones that don't concern us. The artillery duel, machine gun fire at the next company to us, desultory rifle fire. But the faint plop of the mortar that sends off the sausage, or the muffled rifle noise when a grenade is fired, we pick out at once. The men are much afraid, yet always joking, which of course the point has just been made. The company sergeant major stands behind number 11 brick stacks and shoots at the sausages with a rifle as they come over, trying to explode them in the air. He says it's better than pigeon shooting. And so he goes on, he's telling you about all the noises that are to be heard at the front. Apart from the passage describing brothels and soldiers' frequent visits there, which so annoyed Sassoon, he said, how did Graves know about that? Well, how did Sassoon know about that? Don't think they were both convinced homosexuals at the time, so it wouldn't have helped them. Graves has great fun, apart from that, describing the absurdity of army protocol at times. I won't read you all of it, but in extract 10, the second half of extract 10, they've come to a village of Vermel. Have you got it? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. That really doesn't matter. Next morning, we found the deserted garden of the town very pleasant to walk in. They are quite overgrown, and the flowers have seeded themselves about wildly. Red cabbages and roses and Madonna lilies are now the chief ornament. There is one garden with currant bushes in it. I and the company sergeant major started eating along the line towards each other without noticing each other. When we did, we both remembered our dignity. He as a company sergeant major, and I as an officer. He saluted, I acknowledged the salute. We both walked away. After a minute or two, we both came back, hoping the coast was clear. And again, after an exchange of salutes, had to leave the currents and pretend that we were merely admiring the flowers. The company sergeant major was a regular, and it was natural in him. And I suppose that it was courtesy to his scruples that made me stop. Anyhow, along came a couple of privates and stripped the bushes clean. And you see, again, there is a method in the madness, isn't there? It's an entertaining story, but it's also highlighting the fact that these silly little army protocols, I mean, why shouldn't they, if they were living on very little fruit, why shouldn't they go and strip the bush of currants? But they can't because of their ranks in the army. He never hesitates to criticize absurd behavior where he sees it. There's one occasion on which the officer in charge is told, in charge of the gas cylinders, is told to discharge the gas before an attack. And he points out that there is no wind, so the gas will not be blown across. And he says, dead calm, impossible discharge accessory. To which he received the reply, accessory to be discharged at all costs. Then the inevitable failure results. The wind, instead of there being no wind, blows the other way. People in the British line are killed. So you can see that all the time Graves is really indicating that the war itself has many, many absurd aspects to it. And particularly does he agree with Alan Clark that most of the people at the top, all of the generals, are donkeys. I mean, you know, he'd have been there signing the book if he'd known of that book. I take it some of you do. There are so many other topics, and that some more serious than others. Religion, which of course for many is lost in the trenches, but superstition replaces it instead. The differences between the officers and the men and the way they deal with things. The rumors are particularly fierce in the war. And the rumors that circulate about France, the number of executions of soldiers, which are never allowed to reach England. The news of these doesn't reach England, but apparently happens all the time. Soldiers who have deserted and been executed. There are also some significant omissions. Close military detail, as I've said, is not given. And despite the fact that he's told us of his growing interest in poetry at Charterhouse and his first effort at it, not one of his own poems is given in the war section, though he does refer to one of his favourite poets, one of my favourite poets, Charles Hamilton Sawley, who is killed just a short space away at the Battle of Loos. Part of the reason why Graves doesn't give you the poetry is that he has, by this point, decided to suppress a great deal of it, partly, I think, under Laura Riding's influence. So let me see. There we are. There he is at this period of his life. It is one of the things he's trying to say goodbye to the war, and therefore perhaps one of the reasons he doesn't give you any of the poetry. It's probably why, if you ask any intelligent group, well-read group of people, say 6 people, who are the war poets? Most people will say Robert Graves, won't they? You associate him with the First World War. But if you ask them for the titles of any of the poems, you might get 1, you might get 2. I got 1 yesterday. But you will never get as many as if you ask them about Siegfried Sassoon. understandably because he suppressed them in his 1927 collection of poems. But I want to end, that's a relief, isn't it? I want to end with a poem by Robert Graves, which was written during the war. He wrote furiously, many, many war poems during the war. And this is my first effort to resuscitate him. It's called The Patchwork Quilt. His wife was a great needlewoman and made a great many patchwork quilts. Here is this patchwork quilt I've made of patterned silks and old brocade, small faded rags in memory, rich, sewn to each with feather stitch. But if you stare aghast, perhaps, at certain muddied khaki scraps of trophy fragments of field grey, clotted and torn, a grim display that never decked white sheets before, blame my dazed head, blame bloody war. Thank you.